Hello everyone, and welcome once again to Caleb Likes Books. Today I'm going to be doing another video that is adjacent to books somewhat, but is actually also exploring another one of my hobbies, that being heavy metal music. And today I'm going to be talking about the influence of H.P. Lovecraft on metal. Now, earlier this year, I did a video about the influence of the fantasy genre on heavy metal, which was a video that I really enjoyed doing, and one that some of you seem to have enjoyed as well. So I figured for this video, as a part of the ending of that video, I think, I actually discussed some Lovecraft influences on metal, but I figured eventually I would want to do a whole video about that because, you know, Lovecraft's influence on metal is much bigger than what I can summarize in like 1 or 2 minutes at just the ending of another video. And so I wanted to do a full video about Lovecraft specifically and his influence on metal. So, of course, Lovecraft, being a horror author, had a big influence on the metal genre. Metal in general, not in all cases, but in a lot of cases, does take some influences from, you know, horror media in general, whether that be movies or books or things like that. There's some bands that have taken influence from like Edgar Allan Poe. Some bands, such as one that comes to mind for me is Ice Nine Kills, takes influence from horror movies and things like that. So of course, you know, Lovecraft being one of the biggest horror authors out there, a lot of metal bands have taken heavy influence from Lovecraft in several different ways. The most predominant way for that is probably lyrical themes, obviously. You know, Lovecraft being a writer, you know, a lot of his writing influenced what these bands actually talk about in their songs. Metal as in general, again, not in all cases, you know, but it depends on the style of metal, I guess. But, you know, generally metal is thought of, and in many cases is like this, of having lyrical themes centered around general darkness and negativity, I guess, which is a bit of a stereotype that isn't entirely accurate in a lot of cases. But when you get into the more extreme genres of metal, there definitely are some lyrical themes leaning that way, leaning towards things like nihilism or insignificance of humanity, or just general dark themes and things like that, which are all things that Lovecraft very heavily worked with in his work. Not to say that necessarily every single band that works with those themes is directly influenced by Lovecraft, but that is definitely a similarity between the two, and a lot of bands who have those sorts of lyrical themes either may have directly stated that Lovecraft was an influence on them and their philosophy and the way they write their lyrics, or maybe it was an indirect influence based on what they have heard from other sources, or you know, all that kind of thing. And then you also have the influence of Lovecraftian imagery on metal as a genre, which one of those ways that I've seen, especially recently actually, is like creature designs on like album artwork. There is actually a lot of albums coming out nowadays. I especially see it more so in like death metal, for example, especially like technical death metal if you want to get really specific, or even deathcore, of bands having either merchandise designs or album artwork that just features these really weird creature designs on them. And a lot of those times I feel like those creature designs are very Lovecraftian influence. They look kind of similar to, you know, the tentacle monsters or the weird alien creatures or whatever that Lovecraft may have worked with. And then you also have other imagery. You know, Lovecraft in his works did a lot of focusing on cults and cultish activities, especially, you know, you look at something like the Call of Cthulhu, which directly has a cult of Cthulhu, you know, and metal, again, not in all cases, but generally at times does kind of focus on that sort of imagery, that kind of occult imagery, darker imagery, like I said earlier with the lyrical themes, just darker subject matter, sometimes leaning into the occult, oftentimes more so leaning towards satanic imagery and things like that, which, you know, again, is a stereotype. That's not, it's usually just done for show. It's usually theatrics in most cases. But there are times when it leans more occult rather than satanic, which I guess maybe isn't exactly two completely different things, but to make that distinction, not necessarily satanic, but more so occult, I guess. I don't know exactly the distinction there, but in my mind they're two different things. So you obviously have all those different influences. And something that I think is very interesting about Lovecraft specifically, like very directly influencing metal, not just in terms of general lyrical themes or general imagery, is that his influence on metal started way back at the beginning, which I find really cool. You have Black Sabbath, who released their first album called Black Sabbath way back in 1970, which is generally considered to be the very first heavy metal album. And on that album, they had a song called Behind the Wall of Sleep, which is also the name of a Lovecraft story. Having read the lyrics and having read the story, granted, I don't remember the story all that well, but I can't really pick out any particular Lovecraftian influences on the lyrics of that song. They don't seem to be as directly influenced. Maybe they were, and it's just been too long since I've read the story. But you have that on the very first heavy metal album ever recorded. And then you also have Metallica, obviously, probably the biggest metal band in the world ever. Two songs come to mind specifically. They may have more than these two, but these are the two most popular ones that I've seen. They have the final song on their album, Master of Puppets, which is just called The Call of Cthulhu, although the name Cthulhu is spelt differently than it normally is. Which I believe is an instrumental, so obviously there's not really any lyrical similarities there, but the name of the song is The Call of Cthulhu. But then on another song, which I believe is called The Thing That Should Not Be, or something like that, on their album Ride the Lightning, or I may have gotten these mixed up. I'm pretty sure it's on Ride the Lightning, if I remember correctly. That song, as far as I can tell, is directly about the Lovecraftian entity Nyarlathotep. So even going back way, to the classics of heavy metal, it has always been influenced by Lovecraft in some capacity, whether it's indirect or very direct, which I just think is really cool. And then, of course, nowadays, and, for the last several years, but I think especially now, becoming more popular, you have bands who are very directly taking influence from Lovecraft for their imagery, for their lyrics. Some bands will take stories and write their music about them, or create their own stories and write music about them. I talked about that in my fantasy and metal video. You have bands taking influence from Tolkien, writing songs directly about Tolkien's works, for example. And you have the same thing going on with Lovecraft nowadays, with several different bands. Although the two, I would say two of the most popular ones, and the two that I'm the most familiar with, are the Great Old Ones and Sulphur Aeon. These are two bands. Great Old Ones is a black metal band, and Sulphur Aeon is a death metal band that take heavy influence from Lovecraft, both in their lyrics and in their imagery. Obviously the Great Old Ones, directly, the name of their band comes from Lovecraft. They have an entire album about the Shadow over Innsmouth. I believe it's about the Shadow over Innsmouth anyway, from what I can remember. They have several songs that are directly referencing or about Lovecraft stories or the characters within his Cthulhu mythos. Same thing with Sulphur Aeon as well. Their first album has a picture of Cthulhu on it, so I don't know how much more obvious they can get about that. So you have those bands. There's also another band that is not quite as well known, but I also am a fan of, called Ultar, which also has lyrics and themes and imagery surrounding Lovecraft, and all of that stuff. And then you also have some other bands here and there that do Lovecraftian things. For example, the band Septicflesh has a song called Lovecraft's Death. You do also have very direct influence of Lovecraft, even nowadays in metal, with a lot of bands, focusing basically their entire band around his work, which I think is just really cool. So now that I've talked a bit about Lovecraftian bands more directly, bands that are actually directly influenced by Lovecraft and his works, now I'm going to talk a bit about some bands that maybe aren't as directly influenced, but to me kind of have that similar vibe to them, either in terms of their sound or their lyrics. So first I'll talk about lyrics because I feel like that's the easier one to go with. The first one I want to mention is a band called Distant. They are a deathcore band who have lyrics that, at least to me, seem to be somewhat Lovecraftian in nature. Maybe not entirely, but they kind of feel a little bit that way to me. They even have had a book released, which I haven't read, but they have had a book released that kind of details the lore around their music. So that kind of strikes me a little bit Lovecraftian, maybe. Another one, some more ones that I feel like are very much more overtly Lovecraftian. You have a band called Jupiterian, who is a doom metal band. Again, they don't directly, use Lovecraftian works to influence their lyrics, but their lyrics are very Lovecraftian. They've kind of built, again, their own lore, their own mythos with their lyrics. That is very Lovecraft inspired, and even their sound as well kind of feels like it fits to me. It's very dark, it's very, I don't know really exactly the best way to explain it, but it feels like it fits to me. The next one I'm going to talk about is one that I have no idea how to pronounce, but I'm going to do my best, which is Chthe'ilist. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that anywhere close to correctly, but this band has not released a whole lot of music, but they're a death metal band that has lyrics about The Legend of Zelda, which may sound weird to bring up in a Lovecraft video, but they have the way that they write their lyrics is very much in the vein of Lovecraft, even though they are dealing with completely different lyrical themes. Lovecraft and Zelda are two very different things. The way they're written is very heavily Lovecraftian inspired. And even though they're dealing with the lore of The Legend of Zelda, it's written in a Lovecraftian fashion, like directly influenced by the actual prose of Lovecraft, which I think is really cool. Next, I want to talk about a few bands that I feel like, in terms of their sound, are kind of Lovecraftian, which is a little bit more difficult to describe, because with lyrics, I can directly say, it's inspired by Lovecraft because it creates its own mythos similar to his, or it's influenced by his prose, or whatever. But the sound is a little harder to describe because, to me, these bands sound like Lovecraft, which is a very difficult thing to really describe. But when I listen to these bands, it makes me feel, it makes me think of Lovecraft, and it feels like, Lovecraft deals with all these different themes and all these, entities beyond human comprehension and all these things. And the music, to me, sounds like that. Best way I can describe it, I'm sorry. The first example that I have is one of my favorites. It's one of my favorite songs ever, and it's my favorite song by this band, I would say, which is a band called Anaal Nathrakh, which is a band that, in terms of themes, like I mentioned at the beginning of this video, kind of deals with similar-ish stuff to Lovecraft, the kind of nihilistic kind of thing. But their lyrics are not directly Lovecraftian. However, they do have a song that, to me, feels very Lovecraftian, feels very apocalyptic, very, it feels like the great old ones have returned and are completely destroying everything or whatever. And that is their song Of Horror and the Black Shawls, which to me just, again, it sounds Lovecraftian. I don't know how else to put it. It just feels apocalyptic and epic and just insane and just absolutely nuts. And I'll probably play a clip of it here. But yeah. Couple more bands to talk about here. Another one that I would say feels somewhat Lovecrafty to me is Bellwitch, which is a funeral doom metal band. This one is maybe out of these the least Lovecraft to me. Out of these four, in terms of the sound. But these guys to me kind of feel Lovecraftian in the sense that they just feel it's very atmospheric music. It's very, you know, just kind of captures a sense of doom, I guess, which makes sense considering they are a doom metal band. But just that feeling of doom and just negative feeling, I guess, of maybe even dread at times, just kind of feels Lovecraftian to me. Again, don't really know how better to explain it. Another one that I'm going to mention is Portal, which is a band that I'm not really that into. I've tried them out. I can't quite wrap my head around it or whatever, but I have heard many people say these guys feel very Lovecraft, and I've heard even their lyrics maybe are kind of like that. Although I haven't really looked into their lyrics myself, but these guys as well just have a very chaotic, very crazy, overwhelming sound that to some people does sound kind of Lovecraftish. The last thing that I want to talk about in this video is a couple bands that are not really Lovecraftian at all, but might pique your interest if you're interested in this sort of thing. And that's the wider genre of cosmic black metal. And there's two bands that I want to talk about really quick. You know, this is a genre that some Lovecraftian bands, such as the Great Old Ones, are lumped into this genre because they do have that cosmic feel to them, plus they deal with the cosmic horror themes, the Lovecraft themes. But cosmic black metal in general does not have to do that. It just feels spacey, I guess is the best way to put it. And there's a lot of different bands doing this sort of thing, but two of my favorites include Mare Cognitum and Mesarthim. So if you're interested in that kind of sound and something that feels cosmic but maybe not as much Lovecrafty, then go check those guys out. But anyways, that is pretty much it for this video. Just something I wanted to do because I really enjoy talking about how art influences other art, and metal in general is something that I'm really into, and I don't get to talk about a whole lot because I don't know a whole lot of people who are also into it. But especially looking at how books and things like that have influenced music and metal is super interesting to me, and something that I just wanted to share with all of you. So let me know down in the comments if you enjoyed this video. I hope you enjoyed this video, found it at least informative or interesting or something like that. And if you happen to be also a metalhead, I hope you maybe found some new bands to check out that might interest you. So let me know down in the comments what you thought of all of the stuff that I talked about in this video, and if you have any suggestions for more similar types of videos to this that I could do, you know, preferably about metal, but even other genres I'd be willing to look into that are influenced by books in some way. Or if you also are a metalhead and you know of some bands that are influenced by other genres of books or other authors or things like that, then let me know down in the comments and maybe I'll do a video about it someday. So that is pretty much it for this video, so thank you all for watching, and I will see you guys next time.